The city animal shelter was having another busy Monday morning. The hallways echoed with barking sounds and the hurried footsteps of shelter workers. In the last kennel of the medical wing, a sick pit bull named Atlas lay motionless on the cold concrete floor. His ribs showed through his skin, which was covered in painful red patches where his fur had fallen out. His eyes, once bright and full of life, now looked dull and tired. Maria, the shelter's head veterinarian for 8 years, stood outside Atlas's kennel with a heavy heart. She held a clipboard with papers that no shelter worker ever wanted to see: euthanasia forms. The morning light coming through the windows made the red urgent stamp on the papers look even brighter. "I really wish we had another choice," Maria whispered to Jenny, a young shelter volunteer who stood beside her. Jenny had been trying to help Atlas for the past 2 weeks, but nothing seemed to work. The sick pit bull wouldn't eat properly, and his skin condition was getting worse every day. "But we can't just give up on him," Jenny said, her voice shaking. She remembered the day Atlas was brought in. A police officer had found him tied to a pole behind an abandoned building. The dog was already sick then, but at least he would wag his tail when people came near. Now, he just lay there, barely moving. Maria shook her head sadly. "We tried everything we can. He's not responding to any treatments, and he's starting to show aggressive behavior. Yesterday, he almost bit Tom when he tried to give him medicine." She pointed to the warning sign they had to put on Atlas's kennel that morning. "Koituan, approach with care." The shelter was already struggling with too many animals and not enough space or money. They had spent a lot of their medical budget trying to help Atlas, but his mysterious illness only seemed to get worse. The mange on his skin was spreading, and now he had started refusing to eat even his favorite treats. Jenny walked closer to the kennel, remembering how she used to be able to sit near Atlas while he ate. But today, when she approached, a low growl came from the corner where he lay. His eyes, though tired, showed fear and pain. It broke her heart to see him like this. A dog who once showed so much spirit despite his condition, now reduced to a fearful, hurting animal. "The morning team will come tomorrow at 8, Maria said quietly, placing the papers in a folder. "We'll make it peaceful for him." She patted Jenny's shoulder before walking away, leaving the young volunteer alone with her thoughts. The shelter's routine continued around them. Other workers walked past with food bowls and cleaning supplies. Dogs in nearby kennels barked at visitors who came looking to adopt. But in Atlas's corner, time seemed to stand still. The big pit bull shifted slightly, his breathing labored. The patches of remaining fur on his body were dull and brittle, nothing like the shiny coat that healthy pit bulls usually had. Through the kennel bars, Jenny could see the untouched food bowl from morning. Next to it lay a red rubber toy, the only thing Atlas had shown any interest in during his first days at the shelter. Now it sat collecting dust, untouched for days. The water in his bowl had tiny bits of fur floating in it, fallen from his increasingly bare skin. As evening approached, the shelter began to quiet down. The last visitors left, and the day shift workers started packing up their things. Jenny stayed longer than usual, sitting on the floor near Atlas's kennel. She talked to him softly, even though he didn't respond. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, making the kennel look even more somber. "I'm sorry we couldn't help you, buddy," Jenny whispered, wiping tears from her eyes. She stood up slowly, her legs stiff from sitting so long. Tomorrow morning would come too soon, bringing with it a final decision that no one wanted to make. As she walked away, she glanced back one last time. Atlas had lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before he lay back down. The shelter lights dimmed for the night, leaving Atlas alone in his corner. Outside his small window, the city continued its busy life, unaware that in this quiet kennel, a once vibrant dog was spending what everyone thought would be his last night alive. No one knew that tomorrow would bring an unexpected visitor who would change everything. Sarah Chen parked her old blue Honda in the shelter's nearly empty parking lot early Tuesday morning. The clock on her dashboard showed 7:15 a.m. She was early for her volunteer shift, but she liked getting there before the shelter became busy. As a third-year veterinary student, she found these quiet morning hours perfect for learning about different animal cases. Today, though, felt different. Sarah had been up most of the night thinking about a dream that wouldn't leave her mind. In it, she had seen a sick dog with sad eyes calling out to her for help. The dream felt so real that she checked the shelter's website as soon as she woke up. That's when she saw him, a pit bull scheduled for euthanasia that morning. Sarah grabbed her backpack, which contained her usual supplies: a notebook, some healthy dog treats, and a worn copy of Dog Body Language, a photographic guide that her professor had given her. The morning air was crisp, and the shelter building looked gray and unwelcoming in the early light. Maria, the head veterinarian, was surprised to see Sarah so early. "You're not usually here on Tuesdays," she said, looking up from her computer. Dark circles under her eyes showed she hadn't slept well either. "I saw the euthanasia list online," Sarah replied quietly. "The pit bull? Could I see him before?" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Maria understood. "Atlas. Sarah, I should warn you. He's not the same dog he was when he came in." Maria pulled up his file on her computer. "See these behavior notes? He's become aggressive, won't let anyone near him, and his skin condition is getting worse. We tried everything." But Sarah wasn't listening to the warnings. Instead, she was looking at Atlas's intake photo from 3 weeks ago. Despite his obvious illness, there was something in his eyes that matched the dog from her dream. "Please," she said, "just give me a few minutes with him." Maria hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful, he's in the last kennel of the medical wing. Don't try to touch him or get too close." Sarah walked slowly down the quiet hallway. The morning cleaning hadn't started yet, and most dogs were still sleeping. When she reached Atlas's kennel, her heart sank. The dog looked even worse than his recent photos. His skin was red and inflamed, with patches of missing fur. He lay in the corner, barely moving. Instead of approaching the kennel, Sarah did something unexpected. She sat down on the floor about 6 feet away, opened her backpack, and pulled out another book. An old copy of Charlotte's Web that she carried everywhere. Then, in a soft, clear voice, she began to read. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. Atlas's ear twitched slightly at the sound of her voice, but he didn't move. Sarah continued reading, keeping her voice gentle and steady. She didn't look directly at him, remembering what she learned about how direct eye contact could threaten scared dogs. Time passed slowly. The shelter began to wake up. Other workers arrived, giving Sarah curious looks as they passed. She kept reading, turning page after page. By the time she reached chapter 2, she noticed something. Atlas had shifted position slightly, turning to face her direction. Maria came to check on them an hour later. She was amazed to see Atlas awake and alert, watching Sarah with interest. The usual growl that greeted visitors was absent. "I've never seen him like this," Maria whispered. Sarah finally looked up from her book. "I think I know what's wrong with him," she said quietly. "Look at how he's scratching, and the pattern of his skin irritation. I just studied this in my dermatology rotation. I don't think it's regular mange. I think he has an autoimmune condition, one that's treatable." She stood up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. Atlas watched her but remained calm. "Please," Sarah turned to Maria, "don't euthanize him today. Let me try to help him. I can foster him, work with my professors to diagnose him properly. He just needs someone to understand what he's going through." Maria looked at Atlas, then at Sarah's determined face. Outside, the morning sun had finally broken through the clouds, sending streaks of light through the shelter windows. In his kennel, Atlas had moved closer to where Sarah stood, his eyes fixed on her, showing the first sign of hope in weeks. Maria gave Sarah permission to stay with Atlas, but with one clear rule. She couldn't enter his kennel yet. It was still too risky. Sarah didn't mind. She had a different plan in mind, one that would take time and patience. She moved her chair a little closer to the kennel and continued reading her book. By lunchtime, other shelter workers were amazed at what they saw. Atlas, who usually hid in the corner all day, was now lying near the front of his kennel. Though still keeping his distance, he watched Sarah with curious eyes. Every time she turned a page, his ears would twitch at the sound. "Would you like to hear some music, Atlas?" Sarah asked softly. She had noticed how he seemed to respond to the rhythm of her voice. Keeping her movements slow, she pulled out her phone and played a gentle classical piece, Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 23. The soft piano notes filled the quiet hallway. Atlas lifted his head, his ears moving forward. It was the most interest he had shown in anything for weeks. Sarah smiled but didn't make eye contact, letting him feel safe and unstressed. Instead, she opened her notebook and started writing down her observations about his skin condition. Jenny, the young shelter volunteer from yesterday, came by during her afternoon shift. She couldn't believe her eyes. "He's like a different dog," she whispered to Sarah. "Yesterday he wouldn't even look at anyone." Sarah nodded, keeping her voice low. "I think he was just overwhelmed. Pit bulls are sensitive dogs, and if he has the condition I suspect, he's been in constant pain. Imagine having an itch you can't scratch, and everyone around you speaks a language you don't understand." As they talked quietly, Atlas did something unexpected. He slowly stood up and walked to his water bowl. It was the first time anyone had seen him drink willingly in days. His movements were stiff and careful, but he was moving. "Look at how he favors his left side," Sarah noted in her book. "The inflammation must be worse there." She had already filled 3 pages with observations about his behavior and symptoms. Her professors had always said that the key to helping sick animals was watching and learning their patterns. The afternoon passed peacefully. Sarah read more of her book, played soft music, and simply sat with Atlas. Sometimes she would talk softly about her day or her studies, never expecting a response. Other times she just sat quietly, letting him get used to having someone near who didn't want anything from him. Around 4 p.m., Sarah did something that surprised everyone. She took out her lunch, a sandwich she hadn't had time to eat earlier. She opened it slowly and took a small bite. Then, without looking at Atlas, she placed a tiny piece of plain bread near the kennel door. Atlas watched the bread for a long time. His nose twitched, and he took a small step forward. The shelter workers gathering for the evening shift change stopped to watch. Nobody moved or made a sound. Finally, very slowly, Atlas approached the kennel door. With gentle movements, he sniffed the bread and ate it. It was a tiny piece of food, but to everyone watching, it felt like a miracle. Atlas hadn't eaten voluntarily in 3 days. Sarah continued eating her sandwich, occasionally dropping small pieces near the kennel, each one a little closer to where she sat. By the time evening fell, Atlas was lying just inches from the kennel door, the closest he had been to any person since arriving at the shelter. His eyes, though still tired, had lost some of their fear. The classical music played softly in the background, creating a peaceful atmosphere in the usually noisy shelter. "I'll come back tomorrow," Sarah promised as she packed up her things. Atlas watched her gather her books and bag. When she stood up, he didn't retreat to his corner as he had done with everyone else. Instead, he stayed near the door, his eyes following her movements. As Sarah left the shelter that evening, she felt hopeful. The connection she had dreamed about was real. Atlas wasn't an aggressive dog. He was a scared, hurting animal who needed someone to understand him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they had made the first crucial step: trust. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the shelter carrying a thick folder and a determined look on her face. She had spent most of the night preparing for this moment. Her apartment was small, but she had already cleared out her spare room, bought a special bed, and stocked up on supplies. Now she just needed to convince the shelter management to let her foster Atlas. "You want to what?" Mr. Thompson, the shelter director, looked at Sarah with surprise. They sat in his small office, surrounded by pictures of rescued animals and stacks of paperwork. "Sarah, I understand you made some progress with him, but taking him home is different. He's still a sick, potentially dangerous dog." Sarah opened her folder and spread out several papers on his desk. "I've been up all night researching his symptoms. Look at these photos I took yesterday. See this pattern on his skin? It matches perfectly with an autoimmune condition called pemphigus. My veterinary professor confirmed it could be treatable." Maria, who was also in the meeting, picked up one of the photos. "But we tried several treatments already," she said, though her voice showed she was starting to believe there might be hope. "Yes, but not the right ones," Sarah explained eagerly. "Atlas needs specific medications, a special diet, and a stress-free environment to heal. I've worked out a complete care plan." She pulled out more papers, schedules, treatment plans, and a budget she had carefully prepared. Mr. Thompson rubbed his forehead. "Sarah, I appreciate your dedication, but there's a lot to consider here. The liability alone." "I've thought of that too," Sarah interrupted, pulling out another document. "I've already spoken to my landlord and got written permission to foster a dog. I've also contacted a certified dog trainer who specializes in medical rehabilitation cases. She's willing to help us. As they talked, Jenny appeared at the office door. Sorry to interrupt, she said, but you need to see this. She held up her phone, showing a social media post about Atlas. The story of the sick pit bull and the veterinary student who sat with him all day had spread overnight. Comments were pouring in from people offering to donate toward his medical care. Mr. Thompson looked at the phone, then at Sarah's carefully prepared plans. You really think you can help him? He asked, his voice softening. I know I can, Sarah replied firmly. But we need to act fast. Every day we wait, his condition gets worse. I'm willing to take full responsibility. Medical costs, care, everything. All I'm asking for is 1 week to show you he can improve. Maria spoke up. I could supervise his medical treatment. Make sure everything's done properly. She picked up Sarah's treatment plan, nodding as she read through it. This is actually very well thought out. The shelter director stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the kennels. The morning sun lit up the room as he thought. Finally, he turned back to them. 1 week, he said. But there will be conditions. We'll need daily updates, photos, and progress reports. Any sign of aggression or serious health decline, he comes back immediately. Sarah's face lit up. Thank you. I promise you won't regret this. When can I take him home? The next hour was a blur of activity. Sarah filled out countless forms while shelter staff gathered supplies. They found a special harness that wouldn't irritate Atlas's skin, and Maria wrote prescriptions for his new medications. Finally, it was time to get Atlas. Sarah approached his kennel slowly, speaking softly as she had done yesterday. Atlas watched her carefully but didn't growl. When she carefully opened the kennel door for the first time, everyone held their breath. Atlas stood up slowly, his tail low but not tucked. Sarah held out her hand, letting him sniff it. Then, to everyone's amazement, he gently pressed his nose against her palm, his first voluntary contact with a human since arriving at the shelter. Hi, buddy, Sarah whispered, tears in her eyes. Want to go home? As she carefully attached the harness, Jenny took a photo. In it, Atlas looked directly at the camera, his eyes showing a spark of life that had been missing for weeks. The photo would later become famous online, marking the beginning of an incredible journey that nobody could have predicted. Getting Atlas into Sarah's apartment turned out to be the first big challenge. The sick pit bull was afraid of the stairs, and the strange new smells made him nervous. Sarah had to carry him up 3 flights, which wasn't easy since he weighed over 60 pounds even in his skinny state. By the time they reached her door, they were both exhausted. Welcome to your new home, Sarah said softly, opening the door to the spare room she had prepared. The space was perfect for a scared dog. Quiet, with a soft bed in one corner and a water bowl nearby. She had covered the window with a light curtain to make the room less bright, and a small fan provided white noise to block out street sounds. But Atlas wouldn't go in. He stood in the hallway, trembling, his tail tucked between his legs. Everything was new and scary for him. Sarah sat down on the floor, remembering how this had worked at the shelter. She started humming softly and pretended to read her book. After 15 minutes, Atlas finally took a few steps into the room. That first night was hard for both of them. Atlas wouldn't touch the special food Sarah had bought, even though it was designed for dogs with skin problems. He paced the room, scratching at his sore skin until Sarah thought of putting some soft baby socks on his back paws to prevent him from hurting himself. It's okay, boy, she kept telling him. We'll figure this out together. Sarah slept on the floor next to his room that night, leaving the door open so he wouldn't feel trapped. Every hour she checked on him. Atlas didn't sleep much either. His skin was clearly bothering him, and the new place made him nervous. Around midnight, Sarah noticed he was panting heavily. Worried about his stress level, she remembered something from her vet school classes about music therapy for animals. She found a playlist of soft piano music and played it quietly. To her relief, Atlas's breathing slowly calmed down. The next morning brought new challenges. Atlas needed to take 5 different medications, but he wouldn't let Sarah near him with the pills. She tried hiding them in cheese, peanut butter, and even hot dogs, but he was too smart and kept spitting out the medicine. Frustrated but not giving up, Sarah called her veterinary professor, Dr. Martinez, for advice. Try crushing the pills and mixing them with bone broth, the the professor suggested. And warm it slightly, the smell might make it more appealing. It worked. Atlas licked the warm broth mixture from a shallow bowl, finally getting the medicine he desperately needed. Sarah nearly cried with relief when she saw him take it. It was a small victory, but an important one. That afternoon, they had their first visit from Lisa, the dog trainer who specialized in rehabilitation cases. She watched Atlas from the doorway and nodded approvingly at Sarah's setup. "You've done well making him feel safe," she said. "But now we need to help his mind heal along with his body." Lisa showed Sarah how to read Atlas's body language better. The way his ears moved when he was anxious, how his wrinkled forehead meant he was worried. They worked out a schedule that wouldn't overwhelm him: medication times, quiet periods, and short training sessions. By the end of the second day, Sarah was exhausted but hopeful. She had already filled 5 pages in her notebook with observations about Atlas's behavior, his reactions to different foods, and which spots seemed to bother him most. She took photos to document his skin condition and sent detailed updates to the shelter as promised. That evening, something special happened. Sarah was sitting on the floor, updating her care notes, when she felt something warm against her leg. Atlas had quietly moved closer and was now lying down beside her, not touching but closer than he'd ever been. His eyes were still wary, but there was something else there too, a tiny spark of trust. As night fell, Sarah played the piano music again. This time, Atlas fell asleep faster, his breathing steady and calm. Looking at him resting peacefully, Sarah allowed herself to smile. They had a long way to go, but they had made it through the hardest part, the beginning. 1 week had passed since Atlas came home with Sarah. Early morning sunlight streamed through the curtains as Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, updating her care journal. She smiled as she looked at the victory list she had started keeping. Day 3. Atlas ate a full bowl of food without encouragement. Day 4. First tail wag when seeing morning breakfast. Day 5. Stopped hiding when hearing street noises. Day 6. A loud gentle touch on his head for 5 seconds. Today would be the big test. Mr. Thompson and Maria from the shelter were coming to check on Atlas's progress. Sarah had been sending them daily photos and updates, but seeing him in person would be different. She hoped they would notice the small changes that meant so much. Atlas lay on his new bed, watching Sarah with alert eyes. The angry red patches on his skin were starting to fade, thanks to the right medication and special baths with medicated shampoo. Small tufts of new fur were beginning to grow in some spots. He still scratched sometimes, but much less than before. "Ready to show everyone how brave you've been?" Sarah asked softly. Atlas's tail thumped gently against his bed. Another new behavior that filled her heart with joy. A week ago, he wouldn't even respond to her voice. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 a.m. Atlas lifted his head, but didn't hide or growl. Sarah had worked with him all week, playing recordings of doorbell sounds at low volumes while giving him treats, slowly helping him understand that visitors weren't scary. Maria entered first, carrying her medical bag. Mr. Thompson followed, holding a folder of paperwork. They both stopped in surprise when they saw Atlas. Instead of the frightened, aggressive dog they remembered, they found him calmly watching them from his bed. "This is remarkable," Maria said, kneeling slowly to examine Atlas from a distance. "His skin tone is so much better." She took out her camera to document the changes. Atlas stayed calm, only moving closer to Sarah when Maria used the camera flash. Sarah showed them her detailed records: medication times, food intake, behavior changes, and even recordings of his breathing patterns during sleep. "The classical music was a breakthrough," she explained. "When he's stressed, it helps him calm down. And look at this." She took out Atlas's favorite new toy, a soft purple dinosaur. Holding it up, she squeaked it gently. Atlas's ears perked up, and to everyone's amazement, he stood up and walked over to Sarah, gently taking the toy from her hand. It was the first time the shelter staff had seen him play. "I can't believe this is the same dog," Mr. Thompson said, shaking his head in wonder. "When's the last time he showed any aggressive behavior?" "Not once since we got home," Sarah replied proudly. "He was never aggressive. He was just in pain and scared. Now that his skin is healing and he feels safe, his real personality is showing." As if to prove her point, Atlas brought the dinosaur toy back and dropped it at her feet, asking to play again. His tail wagged slowly, and his eyes were bright with interest. When Sarah reached to pick up the toy, he didn't flinch or back away. Maria did a gentle medical examination, impressed by how cooperative Atlas had become. His temperature was normal, his eyes were clear, and his skin was significantly improved. "Whatever you're doing," she said to Sarah, "it's working. I think it's safe to say he can stay." Mr. Thompson agreed, signing the papers that would extend Atlas's foster period. "You've done an amazing job," he told Sarah. "Would you consider sharing his story? It might help other shelters understand that some dogs just need a chance and the right care." After they left, Sarah sat with Atlas on his bed, scratching gently behind his ears. Something that would have been impossible a week ago. She looked at the photos from his first day at the shelter compared to now. The physical changes were clear, but the biggest difference was in his eyes. Where there had once been fear and pain, now there was life and hope. Atlas leaned against her leg, letting out a contented sigh. Outside, the city buzzed with activity, but in their quiet corner, everything was peaceful. The morning sun caught the tiny patches of new fur growing on Atlas's back, making them shine like silver. It was a small thing, but like everything else this week, it felt like a miracle. 2 months had passed since Atlas first came home with Sarah. The change in him was so dramatic that visitors often didn't believe he was the same dog from the shelter photos. His coat had grown back thick and shiny, with only a few small patches still filling in. His eyes were bright and alert, and his tail wagged constantly. Sarah sat on her small balcony one sunny morning, drinking coffee and watching Atlas play with his favorite purple dinosaur toy. He had gained 20 pounds of healthy weight, and his muscles were strong from their daily walks. But the biggest change wasn't just physical. It was in how he behaved around people and other animals. "Remember how scared you were of everything?" Sarah said softly. Atlas looked up at her voice and trotted over, resting his big head on her lap. He now understood several commands and had even learned to give his paw when asked. Lisa, the dog trainer, called him one of her best students. That afternoon, they had a special visitor. Jenny from the shelter was bringing a sick puppy that needed help. The puppy had the same skin condition Atlas had suffered from, and Sarah had offered to help with the treatment plan. But more importantly, Atlas would be meeting another dog for the first time since his recovery. When Jenny arrived with the small, trembling puppy wrapped in a towel, Atlas surprised everyone. Instead of being nervous or excited, he lay down calmly on his bed, making himself look as non-threatening as possible. It was exactly what Lisa had taught him to do around scared animals. "This is amazing," Jenny said, watching as the nervous puppy slowly began to explore the room. Atlas stayed perfectly still, his eyes gentle and interested. When the puppy finally approached him, Atlas gave a tiny tail wag but didn't move, letting the little one gain confidence. Sarah took pictures of them together, the big, healthy pit bull and the tiny, sick puppy. "These will be perfect for his therapy dog application," she said excitedly. After seeing how gentle Atlas was, Lisa had suggested he might make a good therapy dog, visiting sick animals and scared dogs at the shelter. Later that day, Sarah took Atlas for his regular checkup at the veterinary clinic where she studied. The staff, who had heard about his case, gathered to see him. Atlas walked proudly through the clinic, no longer afraid of the medical smells or strange sounds. He even sat still for his examination, remembering the treats that always followed. "If you had told me 2 months ago that this would be the same dog, I wouldn't have believed it," Dr. Martinez said, checking Atlas's skin. "You should present his case at the next veterinary conference. It could help a lot of other dogs with similar conditions." On their walk home, they passed the local park where children were playing. Parents who used to cross the street when they saw a pit bull approaching now smiled and waved. Atlas had become a neighborhood favorite, known for his gentle nature and friendly tail wags. Back at home, Sarah updated Atlas's progress journal. She looked at the entry from his first day, scared, sick, and unable to trust, and compared it to now. The journal was filled with happy milestones. First time playing with a toy, first successful bath without trembling. First time sleeping through the night. First friendly meeting with another dog, first time rolling over for belly rubs. As she wrote, Atlas brought her his leash, another new behavior he had learned. It was time for their evening walk. Sarah smiled, remembering how she used to have to coax him just to step outside the apartment. Now he loved their walks, especially when they visited the shelter. The shelter staff always made a big fuss over him, showing new volunteers his before pictures. Atlas had become their success story, proof that even the most hopeless cases deserved a chance. His photo hung in the shelter lobby with the words "Never give up" written below it. That evening, as Atlas dozed peacefully on his bed, Sarah received an email that made her heart skip. The Therapy Dog Certification Program had accepted their application. Soon, Atlas would begin training to help other animals the way someone had once helped him. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning when Sarah first read to a scared, sick pit bull at the shelter. Now, Atlas walked confidently through the children's hospital hallway, wearing his bright blue therapy dog vest. His coat shone under the fluorescent lights, and his tail wagged gently as nurses greeted him by name. "Look who's here," called out Amy, one of the regular nurses on the pediatric floor. "Tommy's been asking for Atlas all morning." She led them to a room where a small boy sat in bed, connected to various machines. Tommy's face lit up when he saw Atlas, and the big pit bull's tail immediately started wagging faster. This was Atlas's special gift. Somehow he always knew exactly what each child needed. With some, he would lay his head gently on their bed, letting them pet him while they went through treatments. With others, like Tommy, he would perform his tricks, making them laugh and forget about their illness for a while. "Can he do the dinosaur trick?" Tommy asked eagerly. Sarah smiled and took out Atlas's purple dinosaur toy, the same one from his early recovery days. Atlas sat perfectly still, waiting for his cue. When Sarah squeaked the toy, he went through his routine, spinning in a circle, giving his paw, and finally catching the toy when she tossed it. Tommy clapped with delight, his mother wiping away tears as she watched her son laugh for the first time in days. These moments made everything worth it, all the hard work, the sleepless nights, the challenges they had overcome. After visiting several more children, Sarah and Atlas headed to their next stop, the city shelter where their story had begun. The shelter had changed a lot in the past year. Atlas's story had brought so much attention that they received donations to upgrade their medical facilities. More importantly, they had changed their policies about evaluating sick and scared dogs. "There's our star," Jenny called out as they entered. She was now the shelter's adoption coordinator, and she credited Atlas with changing how she saw difficult cases. "We have someone special for you to meet." In the medical wing, much brighter and more welcoming than it had been a year ago, a new dog lay in a kennel, looking scared and sick. His condition was similar to what Atlas's had been, and the old Atlas would have triggered memories of his own painful past, but the new Atlas knew exactly what to do. He walked calmly to the kennel and lay down nearby, showing the scared dog that there was nothing to fear. Sarah took out her book, the same copy of Charlotte's Web she had read to Atlas that first day, and began to read aloud. The scared dog's ears perked up at her voice, just as Atlas's had done a year ago. Later that afternoon, they had a surprise party waiting at home. Maria, Mr. Thompson, Lisa the trainer, Dr. Martinez, and several of Atlas's regular patients from the hospital had gathered to celebrate 1 year since his rescue. The apartment was decorated with photos showing Atlas's journey, from the sick, scared shelter dog to the confident therapy dog he had become. "I have an announcement," Mr. Thompson said during the celebration. "Thanks to Atlas's story, we've received funding to start a special medical rehabilitation program for dogs like him, and we're calling it the Atlas Program." Sarah hugged Atlas, who was proudly showing Tommy his new toys. She thought about how close they had come to losing this amazing dog, how one small decision to sit and read to a scared pit bull had changed so many lives. The story had gone viral on social media months ago, inspiring other shelters to give difficult cases more time and proper medical care. Atlas now had thousands of followers online who tracked his therapy dog adventures. People would stop them on the street, recognizing the pit bull who had overcome so much to help others. As the party wound down, Atlas curled up in his favorite spot by the window. The setting sun caught his healthy coat, and his eyes were peaceful and content. On the wall above him hung a framed photo, the one Jenny had taken the day Sarah brought him home from the shelter. Below it were the words that had become their motto: "Every soul deserves a chance to shine." Sarah sat beside him, scratching his favorite spot behind his ears. Atlas leaned into her touch, completely trusting, completely loved. They had come full circle, from the darkest moment to the brightest future, proving that sometimes the greatest transformations start with a simple act of kindness.